Thanks, Kaori, for inviting me to do this. It's made me go back and revisit a text I've not looked at for about, well, longer than I would like to imagine. So this is called The Life of Aesop's Fables. The Life of Aesop is a text that accompanied many medieval and early modern editions of Aesop's work. It purports to contain the biography of Aesop, who lived in the 6th century before the Christian era, although the life didn't appear until the 1st century, the Christian era, in an Egyptian text. At the beginning of the story of his life, Aesop is described as being mute and as, quote, foul, overloathly and counterfeited, unquote. That is, he is not properly human in both his lack of speech and his physical appearance. But this does not hold Aesop back. Indeed, it provides a foundation for his status as the speaker of the truth. And I'm just about to read you the opening story, or one of the opening stories from the life of Aesop. It's quite long, but I've taken the liberty of thinking we can start with a story because this is a thing about fables. So this comes from William Caxton's 1484 edition. And for as much as his lord, to whom he was bound, supposed that he was not profitable, he sent him to labour in the fields and to dike and delve in the earth. And on a day as his lord came in one of his fields, one of his labourers gathered figs and presented them to his lord, saying, "My lord, take these figs as for the first fruit of this field." And the lord received them joyously and delivered them to his servant named Agathopus, charging him to keep them till he that day returned from his bane. And it happened that Aesop, coming from his labour, demanded his dinner like as he was accustomed. And Agathopus, which kept the figs, eat of them, and said to one of his fellows, "If I doubted not and feared my master, I would eat all these figs." And his fellow said, "If thou wilt let me eat with thee, I shall find a subtlety, that we shall have no blame nor harm therefore." "And how may that be?" said Agathopus. To whom his fellow said, "When my lord shall come home, we shall say to him that Aesop hath eaten them. And because he cannot speak, he shall not excuse him, and so therefore he will be well beaten." And hereupon they went and eat the figs between them both, saying, "This villain shall be well beaten." And the lord, which came out of the bane, commanded to bring to him his figs. And Agathopus said to him, "Sire, when Aesop came from his labour from the field, he found the cellar open and went in without reason, and hath eaten all the figs." And when the Lord heard this, he was much angry, and said, "Call to me Aesop." To whom he said, "Thou counterfeit churl, how is this happened, that thou hast not be afeard to eat my figs?" Whereof he was afeard, in beholding them that had accused him. And the Lord commanded him to despoil and take off his clothes, for to have beaten him. And he kneeled down at his Lord's feet, and by signs, because he could not speak, prayed his Lord to give him space to excuse him. And his Lord granted it to him. And anon, after he took a vessel full of hot water which was on the fire, and poured the hot water into a basin, and drank thereof. And anon, after he put his finger in his mouth, and cast out that which was in his stomach, which was only water. For that day he had tasted nothing but water. And he prayed that his accusers might semblably drink of that water as he had done. And so they did. And they held their hand before their mouth, because they should have no vomit. But because the water was hot, and their stomach resolved by the water, they vomited out the water and all the figs together. And the Lord, seeing that, said to them, "Why have ye lied to me against this Aesop that cannot speak?" And then he commanded to despoil them, and to beat them openly, saying, "Whomsoever doth or saith wrong of other shall be punished with the same pain that is due therefore." So this is part of the opening story of Aesop's life. And for the philosopher Louis Marin, this origin story of the Fables author is about language and about how we humans convey or fail to convey the truth. The accusation made by Agathopus and his companion is in the form of a story told that is a misrepresentation of what has actually happened. Aesop came in and he ate the figs. But what the life of Aesop shows, Marin argues, is that any response to that narrative that a speaking person, a fully human might have given, would still lack corroboration. I did not eat the figs is simply one person's word against another's. So how to disprove Agathopus's claim if words cannot do it? The mute Aesop, the animal-human hybrid figure who lacks spoken language, turns to his body to make meaning. Instead of words that lack substance, he produces vomit that lacks figs. Unlike language that can speak what is untrue as if it was true, or state what is true and not be believed, the stomach contents cannot deceive, and the truth is revealed through their, rather than words, expression. Aesop is saved, and soon is also granted the capacity to speak, and this comes as a result of an act of kindness. This is another story from the life of Aesop. Aesop returned to his labour, and as he laboured in the field, there came a priest named Isidis, which went toward the city and had lost his way. And he, seeing Aesop, prayed him that he would ensign him the right way for to go into the city. And Aesop received him joyously, and made him sit under a fig tree, and set before him bread, herbs, figs, and dates, and prayed him to eat. This is an image you can see from a late 17th century edition of the life of Aesop. And I think it's important that even in the more sophisticated technologies of etching, you can see that Aesop is still presented as this kind of malformed and, some argue, black figure. The story goes on. He gave them herbs, figs and dates, and prayed him to eat, and drew water out of a pit and gave him to drink. And when he had well eaten, he took him by the hand and set him in the right way for to go to the city. After which things done, the priest lifted up his hands to heaven, making his prayers for Aesop, of whom he had received so good a refreshing. And when Aesop had well laboured for to eschew the great heat of the sun after his usage, he went in the shadow for to rest, and slept under a tree. And then the goddess of hospitality appeared to him, and gave to him sapience and the ability, and she also gave to him the gift of speech, for to speak diverse fables and inventions, as to him which was right devout to hospitality. So where eating and drinking have been used as proof of Aesop's innocence and honesty in the first narrative, here they're used again, but this time to evidence his kindness and care. But in both tales, meaning follows action. Spoken language can only be trusted when it has material substance to support it. This link between meaning and the materials that sits at the heart of the story that precedes the West's most famous collection of beast fables is logical when we consider that throughout those fables, Aesop's is the voice of what was once inhuman, and it is in turn giving voice to what has never been human. It is, to say again, in the material that meaning is made in the fables. In the light of this, we can see that their relegation to the status of children's tales by dominant Western ideas is an attempt to buttress the value of the human and of reason. The accusation of foolish anthropomorphism consigns fables to the realm of the infantile, just as it relegates animal behaviour to the so-called natural, while maintaining our status in the cultural, the immaterial. We express ourselves in language, and what goes into and out of our stomachs is never us at all. The link between meaning making and the physical in the life of Aesop is something that can also be recognised in some of the ways in which contemporary thinkers have used fabling to respond to the set of hegemonic assumptions that accrue around that thing that we have learned to call meaning, reason. Thus, a similar focus on food, but this time on what might be termed the competition for resources rather than food, theft or hospitality, opened up considerations about human understanding for Vincent Després. Standing alongside former primatologist Thelma Rowell, she watched as an extra bowl of food was put down for Rowell's sheep. Després writes that in this context, quote, "If a sheep leaves its bowl, shoves away its neighbour and takes its place and immediately returns to its bowl, or persists and follows the other one to oust it once again, a large number of hypotheses can be formulated, unquote. So rather than focusing on resource availability, the excess of food bowls means that the ethologist can ponder hierarchies, relationships, the complexities of the social world of sheep. Raoul is, in Desprez terms, asking them a question for which there is no fixed answer, and so is allowing them to be interesting on their own terms. What would animals say if we ask the right questions is the title of Desprez' 2012 book. And in his preface to the 2016 English translation of this work, Bruno Latour wrote of the chapters of what he calls Desprez' ABD, sorry, I can't do the alphabet. Well, there we go. He says this: you are about to enter a new genre, that of scientific fables, by which I don't mean science fiction or false stories about science, but on the contrary, true ways of understanding how difficult it is to figure out what animals are up to. Latour goes on, quote, whereas in the traditional genre of the fable, there is no apparent problem in making the animal say something funny, critical, astute, ironic, or silly. Here in Desprez' book, every instance of expression is related to how the questions are asked, unquote. For Latour, the fabulous nature of Desprez' work can be found in her recognition of the difficulty, our difficulty, in communicating. And I think it is this that offers a link between Desprez' work and the life of Aesop. She also seeks meaning in actions, and her interest is in particular in the actions of Raoul's sheep that are freely expressed, that manifest the agency of the actor who needs to do no pleading. In Vampire Toothis Infernalis of 1987, Willem Flusser had gone further than Desprez. This text, he writes, is an analysis of humans made from the perspective of the Vampire Toothis, the vampire squid from hell, and that is she or he, I don't know. Flusser says this of the squid he is thinking with, quote, its sensory organs transmit bits of information to its brain that are no less complex than those transmitted to ours. Its brain must therefore process this data with methods that are accordingly complex. It could not survive any less than we could without having control over these processes. If we were to replace the term reflection, he goes on, with philosophizing, then we would have to concede that no less than we could, the Vampire Toothis could not survive without philosophy. We should thus be able to compare Vampire Toothic with human philosophy and with the sciences that have derived from it, unquote. But this similarity isn't the end of his analysis. Flusser goes on, quote, there's nothing, however, that could possibly be called human philosophy. There are only different methods of reflection, and the sum total of these methods is far too paltry to be called philosophy. Luckily enough, this problem can be circumvented. In the West, where the present fable is being written, he goes on, philosophy has a fairly clear meaning. It is a mode of reflection that was devised not too long ago by a handful of Greeks, unquote. Flusser underscores his point by returning us to the squid's conception. He says the Vampire Toothis would roll with laughter upon learning that the methodological reflection of Homo sapiens sapiens, a millennia-old species, had been developed in only a few European villages, and so late at that, unquote. So reason might be village-born, therefore truly parochial. Parochial, we should remember, originally meaning of or belonging to the ecclesiastical parish. But however insular it is, it has gained terrifying power. And a dominant paradigm, as Françoise Wemmelsfelder has written, is likely to concede its limitations only reluctantly. This is a quote, seeking to reformulate and appropriate novel outcomes in its own terms, unquote. The assessment of human philosophy, the valuation of our reason as a singular and special thing, is difficult to displace. Wemmelsfelder is an animal welfare scientist, and she, alongside other ethologists, is attempting to read animal behaviour from the perspective of the experiencing animal. And she says this: the use of expressive language to describe animal behaviour is still regarded with distrust by many scientists for fear of unwarranted anthropomorphism and the loss of scientific credibility. However, she goes on, the assumption that expressive concepts are anthropomorphic and hence unreliable derives from the belief that the subjective experience of animals is not open to empirical observation, unquote. The proof of human difference, we can express experience because we experience that we have experiences, is made through human reason. Because we humans cannot comprehend animals' experiences, the dominant paradigm that we live within means that we should assume they do not have them. What the animals themselves are experiencing has fallen out of the frame, which is, of course, our frame. What Wemmelsfelder is proposing is that what is perceived as anthropomorphic, the suggestion that a pig can be bored, for example, is not actually anthropomorphic at all. It is, in fact, a true as we can get representation of the animal's real experience. Her work suggests, indeed, that porcine boredom can be considered a welfare issue. And she has collaborated with the artist Andrea Rowe, as you can see the outcome of their collaboration here, who designed party games for pigs, proving that just as they can be bored, so they can also be entertained. The accusation that such behaviour is only ever anthropomorphic, that is, falsely regarded as being like our own, is a kind of silencing of animal behaviour that presents that behaviour as meaningless in the empire of reason. Agathopus believes Aesop lacks the capacity to mean because of his inability to speak, but what he comes to realise is that he, Agathopus, can make meaning without language too. His vomit, his making meaning with his body rather than his mind, makes possible the existence of animal reason. Where Wemmelsfelder uses what she calls expressive language in the representation of animal behaviour in the work by ethologists, as her example of how to reassess how we conceive of animals. Back in the late 16th century, the French philosopher Michel de Montaigne used belief in ghosts as his rhetorical measure of human limitation. His essay, the title is fantastic, "It is a Folly to Measure the True and the False by Our Own Capacity," that's the title of the essay, is a text that can be read as a reflection on the ideas about language and meaning that can also be found in Aesop's life, and that I'm suggesting hover beneath the contemporary contemplations I've mentioned, whether they are consciously recognised by the writers or not. In his essay, Montaigne looks back on his apparently worldly and reasoned disdain for beliefs in, quote, returning spirits, prognostications of future events, enchantments, sorcery, or some other story that I could not swallow. I felt compassion, he says, for the poor people who were taken in by these follies. To be taken in here is to lose agency to true false beliefs, but it's also surely can be read as suggesting being consumed. The believer in follies is turned into an edible lump. They become flesh only, and so less than the human who is not meat. And indeed, who does not eat, it is a story they could not swallow. The reasonable human here is a thinking thing. That typically, Montaigne goes on, quote, and now I think that I was at least as much to be pitied myself. Not that experience has since shown me anything surpassing my first beliefs, and that through no fault of my curiosity, so he has been looking for ghosts, but reason has taught me that to condemn a thing thus dogmatically as false and impossible is to assume the advantage of knowing the bounds and limits of God's will and of the power of our mother nature, and that there is no more notable folly in the world than to reduce these things to the measure of our capacity and competence, unquote. We believe what we have been taught is believable. What that thing called reason that was constructed in a few European villages not that long ago has told us is true. Montaigne, like Desprez, Flusser and Wemmelsfelder after him, asks us to think differently, to look beyond the dominant paradigms that have established our current Western ways of thinking. The judgment I deliver, he writes, is to show that the measure, that is the limit of my own sight, and not of the things I make so bold to criticise. Unquote. It is the human claim to the mastery of reason that is where true weakness lies. The life of Aesop, which establishes the fabler as only just human and as having experienced the status of the non-human as slave and as mute beast, seems to ask us to reassess our assumptions about species difference. It asks us to contextualize the beast fables that come after the life, literally in the book, but also in the world, not just in the classroom among the children, but as something much more troubling. The fables the life shows us can reveal the limitations of human language. Telling stories with those we assume to be only bodies might be a way of undermining that assumption. Thank you.